In the early days of television, there was a quiz show. It was called the $64,000 question. And it was, you have to answer these questions, trivia kind of questions, and if you get them right, if you get the series of them right, you win $64,000. And this was back in the 1950s when $64,000 was considered a fortune. So I've got a question for you for today, and it's more than a $64,000 question. If that show were revived today, it might be called the $64 million question. That's a little bit rich, $1 million. It would be at least $1 million. 64 million, this is a bigger question than that. This could be a $64 trillion question. And how much is $64 trillion? To give you an idea, it's about 3 times the size of the American economy, measured per year. So the GDP, gross domestic product of the United States, is in the low 20 trillion range. So 64 trillion would be 3 times the size of America's economy measured per year, which means that $64 trillion, everybody in the United States would have to do all the stuff they do, all the work they do for money, for value. I've worked for 3 years to get up to around $64 trillion. So what's the question? The question is this. In fact, it's a question. It's not well, it is kind of a question of fact. It's a question that is the sort of thing that historians try to deal with all the time, although this is a much bigger deal than what historians usually deal with. But it is a fundamentally historical question. And the question is this. Are nuclear weapons, it's a historical question, so excuse me, I have to put it in the past tense. Have nuclear weapons been a force for peace since their introduction to the world in 1945, or are they a potential for human annihilation? So are nuclear weapons a good deal or a bad deal for humanity? This is the question. Now, when I put it that way, you might think that it's not really amenable to a definitive answer. And no, it's not. But historical questions are never subject to definitive answers. But a lot of historical questions do lend themselves to, well, we think it's probably this. So if one wanted to figure out what the causes of the French Revolution were, historians have been dealing with this kind of thing all the time. So here the case is, it has to do not with something that happened exactly, but something that didn't happen precisely. And so I'm going to reframe the question slightly. So the question is, if nuclear weapons had not existed, would there have been a World War III by now? And phrased this way, perhaps you can appreciate why I think that this is at least a $64 trillion question. Because if World War III came along, the cost to humanity, just in terms you can measure, would be in the 64 trillion or more range, just in the destruction of all the stuff that humans have built and humans do. Leave aside the destruction of human life, because World War III, in the age that we live in, would certainly result in the deaths of hundreds of millions of people. Occasionally people go so far as to say that it might threaten the extinction of humanity itself. So, once again, to get back at the question, is the absence of World War III the result of the existence of nuclear weapons? So this is the question. And I have sometimes thought that if some philanthropic foundation, an endowment, said, Brands, you can have $10 million, $20 million to do research on some historical question, what would that question be? I'd raise my hand immediately and I would say this very question. So, have nuclear weapons been a good thing or a bad thing for the human race since their invention, since their development in the mid-1940s? So, and to put it more precisely, is it nuclear weapons that prevented the outbreak of World War III? The reason I put it that way is that if you look at the course of the world wars of the 20th century, World War I is in the 1910s, World War II starts in the late 1930s and continues into the mid-1940s. If you had been alive in 1950 or even 1960, considering the relatively rapid sequence of World War I, World War II, you'd certainly be thinking in terms of World War III. When's World War III going to happen? But we're now 75 years out from the end of World War II, and there's no World War III. That is, no World War III yet. So why not? This is a question that is something that historians can deal with, can get at. Why no World War III? And one of the answers put forward most often is because of nuclear weapons. Nuclear weapons make the potential cost of World War III so high that no national leader, no group of national leaders would ever risk World War III, because there's no way you could come out a winner in such a war. Countries go to war usually because they think they're going to win. Sometimes they go because they think they have no choice, but at least they think that going to war is better than not going to war. And the existence of nuclear weapons and the existence of arsenals of thousands of nuclear weapons around the world make it really hard to answer the question, are we better off going to war than not going to war, in the affirmative. So no, the cost of World War III to everybody is going to be so great that no one in his right mind would take his country to war, or no one in his or her right mind take his or her country to war. Of course, that leaves open the potential for the very large exception that maybe people who lead their countries to war aren't in their right minds. We'll set that aside. This is not an unimportant detail, but we're going to set that aside. Anyway, so here's this question, and it's an open-ended question because we don't know the answer. We can say there has been no World War III. We can say that there's been no World War III since the creation of nuclear weapons. And so at least we've got this correlation. The existence of nuclear weapons, the absence of World War III. Looks pretty good. What we're asking is this a causal connection? Did the existence of nuclear weapons prevent World War III? So this is the question I want you to consider. Now, I'm going to give you some historical background on the invention of nuclear weapons, the development of nuclear weapons, the arms race that they gave rise to, and sort of how it played out and how it connected to international affairs, American foreign policy, and the like. So if one wants to find a date for the beginning of the nuclear arms race, I should point out, arms races have been going on for as long, apparently, as there have been arms, and that is weapons. So somebody way back when picks up a stick and figures that he can use it as a weapon. So somebody else is looking for a bigger stick or something that can counter the other guy's stick. So when societies are in competition, they often, unfortunately, reach for weapons. And if somebody reaches for weapons, somebody else reaches for better weapons, different weapons, weapons that can defend against the offensive weapons, and so on. So arms races have been around forever, and I'm not going to go into all arms races. I'm just going to focus on the nuclear arms race, the race in weapons since the beginning of the nuclear age. And so one can say, and I'm going to say, that the nuclear arms race begins with a letter that was written to Franklin Roosevelt by Albert Einstein and another physicist, a guy named Leo Szilard, at the beginning of World War II. And Einstein, at this point, the most famous scientist, certainly the most famous physicist in the world, writes this letter to Roosevelt as President of the United States, saying that the United States ought to look into the possibility that atomic energy can be used to make weapons. The United States needs to look into this because German scientists almost certainly are. Now, Einstein and Szilard, they knew German scientists. The community of physicists was a relatively small group, and they knew these people, and they knew that Germany had some of the top scientists in the world. And they assumed that Hitler's regime would encourage them, perhaps compel them, to see if the breakthroughs of physics that Einstein was most responsible for, in particular the equation E equals mc squared, which connects energy with mass. And Einstein equation asserts, and experiments demonstrated, that when you can either break apart the atomic nucleus or put together atomic nuclei, the result often has a little bit less mass than you started with. And the extra mass didn't just disappear, it was converted to energy. And the nature of the equation is such that a little bit of mass produces a whole lot of energy. So this equation, E equals mc squared, suggested, promised, threatened that you could take a small amount of mass, the amount of mass, let's say, of an element like uranium, that you could, the size of a grapefruit, and you could blow up a battleship with this. So it would be far and away the most powerful explosive in human history. Now, Einstein didn't know if there were going to be technical difficulties that would prevent the harnessing of atomic power this way, but he thought that the Americans ought to look into it because he figured that the Germans probably are, and if they get there first, this could really be bad news for Europe and for the entire world. Imagine if Hitler got his hands on the biggest weapon in human history. So, Roosevelt takes the suggestion under advisement and eventually authorizes the creation of something called the Manhattan Project. This was the atom bomb building program of the United States during World War II. It was top secret, and it brought together the best scientists and engineers in the United States. There was cooperation with Britain on this. The British knew a lot about this stuff. Significantly, there was not cooperation, not official cooperation with the Soviet Union. The United States and Britain and the Soviet Union were all allies in World War II. But in the Manhattan Project, the United States cooperated with Britain and tried to keep even the existence of the Manhattan Project secret from the Soviet Union. This would lend to distrust, suspicion, when the word got out. Actually, even before that, because the Soviets did figure out, they learned from people on the inside that the United States, from spies, that the United States was working on this big bomb and conspicuously not telling the Soviet Union. So, anyway, the Manhattan Project gets underway, and they're busy working. The physicists, scientists, the engineers are working all through World War II. They have not completed work on the bomb at the time of the surrender, the defeat of Nazi Germany in May 1945. And it was fear of the Germans and of a German bomb that started the Manhattan Project rolling. But once it got rolling, the defeat of Germany did not stop the Manhattan Project. They were within weeks, maybe a few months, of having a device that they could test. So the war was still going against Japan, not against Germany anymore, but against Japan, when the first nuclear test took place in the deserts of New Mexico. And the test was a remarkable, astonishing even, success in the sense of this thing actually working. There were people who had been working on the bomb, people who had been sort of working around the group that worked on the bomb, that weren't sure that this thing would ever work at all. It's, it's one thing to work out, write the equations and to do the test, but to actually put the whole thing together and see if it works. Well, when it did work, it exceeded either the highest hopes or the greatest fears of those involved. This explosion was bigger, way bigger, than most of the people involved anticipated. And it caused the explosion, which lit up the sky and sent this enormous fireball, this characteristic mushroom cloud into the sky. It daunted those people who had worked on it. They said, oh my God, what have we done? So anyway, it works. The United States is still fighting against Japan, and Harry Truman has to decide, do I use the bomb? Years, decades afterward, there would be a number of people, a lot of people who said, he really shouldn't use the bomb. It wasn't necessary. Harry Truman took the position, we are fighting against Japan. Japan started this war with a sneak attack. Truman delivered an ultimatum to the Japanese, surrender or risk annihilation. He didn't say exactly how. The Japanese did not surrender. He ordered the use of the atom bomb. The first bomb was used against Hiroshima A second bomb was used against Nagasaki after the Japanese did not surrender upon the use of the first one, Hiroshima. 2 bombs, though, got the attention of the Japanese government, and the Emperor of Japan says, enough is enough, we surrender. So, the atom bomb, this device that was created by the Manhattan Project, led to the end of World War II, at the time when World War II ended. Without the use of the bomb, the war would have gone on. How much longer? Nobody knows. The American War Department was planning for a war that would go on, this is mid-1945, was planning for a war that might go on well into 1946. There would be many, many more American casualties. Now, nobody knows if that actually would have happened or not. But Truman took the position that that might very well happen, and so we've got this big weapon, we're going to use it, and he did. So, at that point, the world knows that there is this thing called an atom bomb. And it was unclear exactly what the atom bomb was to most people, but basically, as I say, the power of the atom had been harnessed to create this huge blast. And once photographers, journalists got to the devastated Japanese cities, and they could see that each one had been flattened by a single bomb, this was a huge deal. Tokyo, the Japanese capital, had been flattened, but it took thousands and thousands of bombs. This is 1 bomb per city, boom, and it's over. So, this is when the world knows that the world has entered the atomic age. And I'm saying atomic age, nuclear age, I'm going to use them interchangeably. So, in 1945, the United States had the bomb. And it's at this point that when you talk of the bomb, people know that you're talking about the atom bomb, or later they call it the hydrogen bomb or the nuclear bomb, but the bomb is the big one. We're not talking about anything smaller than that. Nothing smaller merits anymore the label the bomb. So the United States has the bomb. And not long after World War II ends, the Cold War begins. And so tensions between the United States and the Soviet Union ratchet up. And in America's hip pocket, amid all these tensions, is this atom bomb. And it gave American leaders a certain confidence that the U.S. couldn't be rolled over by the Soviet Union. It is true that the Soviet Union had a larger conventional army than the United States did, but the United States had the bomb. And as long as the United States had the bomb and the Soviet Union didn't, Americans mostly thought, okay, we've got this fallback, we've got the edge. We're not gonna lose the Cold War. There were some who went beyond this position to say, you know, we're not going to have a monopoly of the bomb forever. And maybe what we should do is use it while we can. Maybe we should deliver an ultimatum to the Soviets, this after the Cold War was well underway, and tell them unless they give in on the positions that we dictate to them, we're going to bomb them. Now, the Truman administration never got even close to this. Harry Truman never publicly said he regretted using the bomb against Japan, and I've studied Harry Truman to some extent, and I think he didn't. He felt it was something necessary. He didn't think it was a good thing, but he felt it was necessary. But there's no indication that Harry Truman ever thought of using the bomb against the Soviet Union or against anybody else in peacetime. The difference was, of course, the United States was at war against Japan. But there were some who said, we've got the bomb, the Russians don't, let's use this as leverage now. They'll have to give in because if we tell them, for example, they have to pull Soviet troops out of Poland and Eastern Europe, we can make them do that, because if they don't, we're going to bomb them to smithereens. Truman just decided against this. And so the result was that the United States had the bomb, but didn't get any sort of active payoff from the bomb during this time. Truman's advisors were giving him mixed signals as to how long the United States would maintain its monopoly. Some who had a dim view of Soviet expertise said, we're going to have the bomb for a generation before the Russians figure it out. This was wildly optimistic from the side of the United States. And it underestimated, as well, the efficiency of the Soviet spy system. Efficiency is probably the wrong word. But the Soviets did manage to infiltrate the Manhattan Project, so the atom bomb building project, and they were getting information, crucial technological information on America's bomb. And so they knew, for example, which routes the Americans, technological routes, the Americans had decided were dead ends. So they didn't have to go down those routes themselves, which meant that they could get to the end result sooner than the Americans did. Nonetheless, it was a shock to the American system. It was a surprise, a shock to much of the world when in 1949, just 4 years after the US atom bomb, the Soviets tested their own atom bomb. And now the United States no longer has a monopoly. Now the nuclear weapons race is fully joined. So the United States had this advantage until 1949. Now the advantage is negated. What's the United States going to do now? Well, one of the reasons that the United States, or I should say one of the consequences of America's advantage of having the bomb when the Soviets didn't, was American leaders could cut back on American conventional forces. So the Soviets had a much bigger conventional army. They had a lot more troops who potentially could have invaded America's allies in Western Europe than the United States did to counter them. But the United States had the backstop of the atom bomb. So if they invade, we can always bomb them, and they won't. But now the problem is that if the United States thinks that it can bomb Moscow, the Soviets can threaten to bomb New York or Washington. And so there is this parity now, this sort of standoff at the level of who's got the bomb. So an immediate consequence of the Soviets getting the bomb to match America's bomb is an acceleration, or at least a new phase of the weapons race. Because scientists knew that there were two ways you could harness this atomic energy into a bomb. One was fission. You could break up big atomic nuclei into smaller nuclei, and the sum of the masses of the smaller pieces was somewhat less than that of the original big piece, and the missing mass was energy. But you could get more energy out through fusion. You would take light atomic nuclei, in particular the nucleus of hydrogen, the lightest element, and you could fuse them together, just protons, or there's a version that has one or two neutrons as well, a couple of neutrons, and you could fuse them together and you could make the next heavier element, helium. And fusion bombs actually produce more energy. So the scientists knew that beyond the original atom bomb, there was the H-bomb. Beyond the A-bomb was the H-bomb, the hydrogen bomb, or sometimes called the thermonuclear bomb or the fusion bomb. But it was, well, in fact, in the early 1950s, it was called the super bomb. So there was the bomb, and then there was the super bomb. And as soon as the United States discovered that the Soviets had the bomb, then there was strong pressure on the Truman administration to say, well, we got to get the super bomb. And Truman authorized, okay, we're going to go get the super bomb, this bigger one. So America, the Manhattan Project, newly renamed, goes pell-mell toward the super bomb. And it's only a couple years that it takes the United States to test the super bomb, the hydrogen bomb. Well, so the United States once again has a lead in the arms race, but the lead doesn't last long at all, because the Soviets too, they realize, hey, we're going to work for the H-bomb ourselves. And they come in with the super bomb only months after the American super bomb. So by the early 1950s, there's a new standoff where both sides have these huge, these even bigger weapons that are tens or hundreds of times as big as the bombs that the United States dropped on Japan in 1945. And there seemed to be no outer limit to how big these bombs could be. And so when the United States would test its bombs and the Soviets would test their bombs, these would show up on seismometers, the earthquake measuring devices around the world. And they would send these radioactive plumes of fallout blowing around the world. So you could tell that the other side was testing by the shaking of the ground and the fallout blowing in the air. And so there was, the arms race goes from the kinds of bombs now to how many bombs do you have? So once each side demonstrated that it could get fission bombs and then fusion bombs, then how many of these big bombs do you want? How many are you going to build? And so the race was on for that. So the arms race goes into not just can you have the bomb or the super bomb at all, but how many can you have? And it also shifts gears in how are you going to deliver these bombs? because it's one thing to test a bomb in Siberia, for example, as the Soviets did, but can you actually deliver the bomb over New York or Washington? So the first delivery devices for the big bombs were airplanes. And these were, well, initially the bombers of World War II, but then a new phase of bombers, eventually intercontinental bombers, bombers that could fly across the ocean from bases in the Soviet Union and fly and drop their bombs on targets in the United States or vice versa. And these big bombers were these huge things. In the case of the United States, B-52 bombers. And they could carry these big payloads and drop these bombs. They could fly and fly and fly and fly. And if they could refuel in flight, they could go over and back. But they were prepared to do a one-way flight if necessary. And so there's this arms race in bombers. So what kind of bomber is best? Should it be a jet bomber? Should it be a turboprop? Because what is better at conserving fuel so you can go far longer distance? How about speed? Evasiveness? Are there going to be fighter planes that they have to dodge? So in addition to the race in building the weapons themselves, there's in building the bombs themselves, there's a race in building the delivery devices. Well, by the late 1950s, a new device was coming on scene, and that was missiles. The Soviets really got an edge in the missile race when they launched their Sputnik, an orbiting artificial satellite, in 1957. But it demonstrated that these rockets were now the state of the art. What if you could put these bombs on the top of a rocket and send the rocket into outer space and then come zooming down on the enemy? Well, this is exactly what developed in the late 1950s and into the 1960s. And this put the weapons race in a new category entirely, because at least with the bombers would take several to many hours to get from the base where they take off to the target. And in the meantime, you could talk to the pilots, and if you changed your mind, you could say, come on back. But with the missiles, it doesn't work that way. Once you launch the missile in the first place, you might have half an hour between the launch of a missile in North Dakota and it's hitting the target in Moscow, or in Siberia and hitting Washington or Los Angeles. And furthermore, once they're launched, you can't call them back. So the world is now on this hair trigger. Oh, and it is kind of a hair trigger, because if you get in a crisis where you think that the other side is about to go to war with you, if the other side is about to shoot its nuclear weapons off, you have this strong temptation to think, we better shoot first, because if we don't shoot first, we're going to all be dead and we won't be able to shoot back. So there's this kind of tension, this uncertainty where, we've got these weapons. We know the other side has these weapons. We don't really want to use them. We're not warmongers here. We're not trying to destroy the earth. But if we get in a corner where it looks as though, if we start to think, if we have reason to believe that the other side is going to use theirs, well, it would be foolish, it might be suicidal not to shoot first. Well, this shooting first before the other side is shot, how do you know the other side's going to go first? And so these things get more and more unnerving, because, okay, I think the other side's going to go, so I have to get ready to go. Well, the other side knows that you're getting ready to go. And sometimes with these missiles, in some versions of these missiles, you could actually see them being prepared. And so, they're getting ready to launch. So you think you've got to launch. And so it was entirely plausible that a diplomatic crisis over Berlin, which was a chronic source of trouble between the United States and the Soviet Union, or over the Taiwan Strait, which was trouble between the United States and China was an ally of the Soviet Union, or over Korea, or over any number of places, that the superpowers could fear that the other side was going to shoot, and so be tempted to shoot itself. And the world lived in a state of chronic anxiety about this, because precisely this, are they going to go? Are we going to go? Do we go first? Do we go second? How does this work? It made people realize that a war could break out without anybody really wanting it to happen. Memories in the 1950s and 1960s stretched back far enough to the 1910s to know that World War I broke out. Despite the fact that almost nobody really wanted a war, there was blundering into war. And people drew scenarios whereby the world could blunder into a nuclear war. But the difference of World War I was, okay, it killed millions of people, but it didn't threaten the entire human race. World War III might be blundered into similarly, and who knows if the human race would survive it at all. So This is the question that confronts American leaders, Soviet leaders, and the world when the most acute crisis of the nuclear age comes to a head in 1962. More on that in a moment.